I never expected that my quiet life would be shaken like this. Not at my age. After all, aren't these the years where we settle into comfort, where surprises become less frequent and our desires dim into the background? That's what I used to think, at least. But I was wrong. It started innocently enough, as these things often do. My nephew Bram brought his friend Emrys to stay for the week, a polite, quiet young man with a sharp mind and a keen interest in the art of food. I was charmed by his curiosity, impressed by his talent, and flattered by his endless questions about my years in the culinary world. But I didn't see it at first. The way his gaze lingered a little too long, the warmth in his voice when he spoke my name, the unspoken intensity that grew between us as we worked side by side in my little kitchen. I didn't see it, or maybe I chose not to. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to turn back. Now, as I sit here in the glow of the evening sun, I can't help but replay those moments in my mind. The dishes we cooked, the quiet confessions we shared, the way my heart raced in a way it hadn't in decades. And that one evening when the boundaries blurred, when propriety faltered, and we both crossed into a place we swore we'd never go. What happened between us was fleeting, yet it left a mark on me, a mark I carry with equal parts shame and longing. This is my story, and it's not an easy one to tell. My name is Cordelia, though most people in my small village know me as Mrs. Parrish, the retired chef who lives in the ivy-covered cottage on the hill. For years, I ran a celebrated cooking school in the city, teaching eager students the art of French cuisine and hosting elaborate dinners that were the envy of the culinary world. Those days were thrilling, exhausting, and full of life. Now, things are quieter. I moved here 15 years ago, after my divorce and the sale of my business. My days are spent tending to my garden, experimenting with new recipes, and occasionally hosting private workshops for food enthusiasts who seek me out. It's a peaceful life, one that I've grown to cherish. But sometimes, late at night, I feel the pang of loneliness, the ache of a life that has become too predictable. When Bram called to ask if he could bring a friend for the week, I agreed without hesitation. Bram has always been dear to me, the closest thing I have to a child. He's 28 now, a bright young man working in finance, though his creative spirit seems to clash with the rigidity of his career. He visits often, bringing life and energy to my otherwise quiet home. His friend Emrys was a surprise. When they arrived, Bram bounding through the door with his usual exuberance, Emrys followed more cautiously. He was tall and lean, with dark, wavy hair that fell just shy of his collar, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. There was a quiet intensity about him, a sense of thoughtfulness that intrigued me. "This is Emrys," Bram said, clapping him on the shoulder. "He's a food photographer, and a damn good one too. I thought you two might have a lot to talk about." Emrys offered a small, shy smile and shook my hand. His grip was firm but careful, his touch warm. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Parrish," he said. "Bram's told me so much about your cooking. I've seen some of your old features in culinary magazines. Your work is incredible." I laughed, a little flustered by the praise. "Well, those were many years ago, but thank you. And please call me Cordelia." The week began quietly enough. The two of them spent their days exploring the village and the surrounding countryside, returning in the evenings for hearty dinners I prepared with fresh ingredients from my garden. Emrys often lingered in the kitchen while I cooked, asking questions about techniques, ingredients, and the stories behind my recipes. "I didn't know food could tell a story," he said one evening as I kneaded dough for a rustic loaf of bread. "Oh, it does," I replied. "Every dish has a history, every recipe a memory. Cooking is like storytelling, it's just that the story unfolds on the plate." He seemed fascinated by this idea, his eyes alight with curiosity as he snapped a photo of the flour-dusted counter. "Do you miss it?" he asked suddenly. "Miss what?" "The school, the city, the excitement of it all." I paused, surprised by the question. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but life has its seasons, doesn't it? This quieter season suits me now." He nodded, though there was a glimmer of something unreadable in his expression. As the days went on, our conversations grew deeper. He told me about his struggles to find his place in the competitive world of food photography, the self-doubt that crept in when he compared his work to others. I shared my own insecurities, the fear I'd felt when I opened my school, and the heartbreak of watching my marriage dissolve under the strain of ambition. "It's funny," I said one evening as we sat in the garden, a bottle of wine between us. "No matter how much we achieve, those little voices of doubt never seem to go away, do they?" He smiled, a touch sadly. "No, they don't. But I think that's what keeps us growing, keeps us striving for something better." There was a wisdom in his words that belied his age, and I found myself increasingly drawn to his perspective, his quiet confidence, and the way he seemed to truly see me, not just as a retired chef, but as a woman with a history, a story worth telling. On the third day of their visit, Bram decided to take a solo hike in the hills surrounding the village. I had offered to pack him lunch, but he brushed it off with his usual exuberance, claiming he'd find a pub along the way. That left Emrys and me alone in the house for most of the day. I was in the kitchen, chopping herbs for a stew, when Emrys wandered in. He carried a stack of books he'd pulled from the shelves in my study, old culinary texts and a few of my personal journals from my teaching days. "I hope you don't mind," he said, setting the books on the table. I couldn't resist. "Your collection is amazing." "Not at all," I replied, glancing at the titles. "Some of those haven't been opened in years. I'm glad they found an admirer." He smiled and opened one of the journals, thumbing through its pages with care. "You've lived such an incredible life. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough with mine." I stopped chopping and looked at him. "You're what, 24? You have plenty of time to do incredible things." "Maybe," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But sometimes it feels like I'm just treading water, waiting for something to happen. I look at people like you who've built so much and I can't help but feel behind." I wiped my hands on a towel and sat down across from him. "Do you know what I felt at 24? Terrified. Every time I walked into my kitchen, I worried I'd make a mistake so big it would ruin me. And sometimes I did make mistakes, huge ones. But I learned that success isn't about avoiding failure, it's about what you do after." He nodded, absorbing my words. "That's easy to say when you've already succeeded." "True," I admitted, "but you're already further ahead than you realize. You have a gift, Emrys, and you have time to grow into it." He met my gaze then, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Gratitude? Admiration? Whatever it was, it made my heart stutter in a way that caught me off guard. "Thank you," he said softly. "That means a lot coming from you." I smiled and stood, breaking the moment before it could linger too long. "Now, if you want to help, grab that sack of potatoes and start peeling. I'll teach you a trick that'll save you hours in the kitchen." We spent the afternoon side by side, peeling, chopping, and laughing as I shared stories from my years as a chef. He asked thoughtful questions, his curiosity as sharp as the knives he handled with surprising skill. As the stew simmered, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma, he set down his knife and turned to me. "Cordelia, do you ever think about the things you gave up for your career?" The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes," I admitted. "I gave up a lot, family, stability, even love in a way, but I also gained so much. The key is learning to be at peace with the trade-offs." He nodded but didn't reply, his expression contemplative. I wondered what was going through his mind, but before I could ask, the timer went off, signaling the stew was ready. That evening, after Bram returned from his hike, exhausted and sunburned, he retired early, leaving Emrys and me alone once again. I offered him a glass of wine, which he accepted, and we took our seats in the cozy sitting room by the fire. The conversation drifted back to food, as it often did, and Emrys mentioned his struggles with photographing desserts. "It's the lighting," he explained, "and the textures. They're so delicate, so easy to mess up." "Well," I said, setting down my glass, "I happen to have a few tricks for that. If you're up for it, we could whip up something simple and practice." His face lit up. "I'd love that." We returned to the kitchen, and I decided on a simple chocolate soufflé. Elegant but forgiving enough for an impromptu lesson. As I gathered the ingredients, Emrys set up his camera, his movements quick and efficient. The process was easy, familiar, but it felt different with Emrys there, his quiet energy filling the space. He watched closely as I demonstrated each step, his questions sharp and insightful. When the soufflé was in the oven, I began preparing the garnish, a dusting of powdered sugar and a drizzle of raspberry coulis. Emrys stood close, his camera in hand, capturing each detail with careful precision. "Let me try," he said, setting the camera aside and picking up the sieve. His first attempt was clumsy, the sugar clumping unevenly across the plate. "Not like that," I said, laughing. "Here, let me show you." I moved behind him, guiding his hand with mine as he held the sieve. The moment stretched as our hands lingered together, the warmth of his skin against mine, sending a ripple of awareness through me. I stepped back quickly, my cheeks warming. "There, you've got it now," I said, my voice a little too bright. He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Cordelia," he said softly, his gaze holding mine. Something in the air shifted then, a tension that neither of us acknowledged but both felt. The kitchen, usually a place of comfort and familiarity, suddenly felt too small, too intimate. I cleared my throat and busied myself with the plating, desperate to break the spell. But as I handed him the finished plate, our fingers brushed, and the electricity of that brief contact sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment, I thought I saw something in his eyes, something that mirrored the turmoil I was feeling. But he quickly looked away, his cheeks tinged with a faint blush. "Beautiful work," I said, forcing a smile. "You'll make an excellent food photographer." He returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Only because I have an excellent teacher." The moment passed, but its echo lingered long after I retired to my room that night. Lying in bed, staring at the moonlit ceiling, I couldn't shake the memory of his touch, his gaze, the unspoken tension that had simmered between us. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment, born of proximity and wine. But deep down, I knew better. The next day brought a sudden storm. Rain lashed against the windows, and the gray skies dimmed the usually bright rooms of the cottage. Bram, ever restless, decided to drive into the nearby town, leaving Emrys and me alone once more. We spent the morning in companionable silence. He edited photos in the sitting room while I sorted through my recipe collection. By midday, the rain had intensified, and I suggested we cook something warm and indulgent to match the weather. "Comfort food?" he asked, his smile brightening the dreary afternoon. "Exactly," I said, pulling a cookbook from the shelf. "How do you feel about making a croquembouche?" His eyes widened. "The tower of cream-filled pastries? That's ambitious." "Ambitious but worth it," I said with a grin. "Come on, I'll guide you through it." The kitchen quickly filled with the sounds of whisking, sizzling, and laughter. Emrys was a quick study, his hands steady as he piped cream into the choux pastries, his focus intense as he spun golden threads of caramel. "You're a natural," I said, stepping closer to examine his work. He looked up, his face alight with pride. "Only because I have the best teacher." There it was again, that look. His eyes lingered on mine, the warmth in his gaze making my breath catch. For a moment, the bustling kitchen seemed to still, the air between us charged with unspoken words. I turned away, reaching for the caramel to mask my unease. "Let's finish this tower before the caramel hardens," I said briskly, though my hands trembled slightly as I worked. We assembled the croquembouche together, our fingers brushing occasionally as we arranged the pastries into a towering pyramid. Each touch sent a spark through me, and I saw the same flicker of awareness in his expression. When we finished, the golden tower gleamed under the soft kitchen light, a testament to our shared effort. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice quieter now. "You were right, it was worth it." I smiled, though my heart was pounding. "Let's sit, we deserve a break after all that work." We carried plates of the pastries into the sitting room and settled by the fire. The storm raged outside, but the warmth of the room wrapped around us like a cocoon. As we ate, the conversation turned more personal. He spoke of his family, a distant father, a mother who had always encouraged his creative pursuits. I shared stories of my own parents, of the small bakery my mother had run, which had sparked my love for cooking. "You've built so much," he said, his tone reverent. "Not just a career, but a life. It's inspiring." I looked at him, startled by the depth of his admiration. "It's not always as it seems," I said softly. "There are sacrifices, regrets, things I wish I'd done differently." "Like what?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. I hesitated, feeling the weight of his question. "I suppose I wish I'd allowed myself to be more open, to take risks, not just in my career but in my life. I was so focused on building something lasting that I forgot to enjoy the moments along the way." His expression softened. You're enjoying the moments now, aren't you? Yes, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I am. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. He set his plate aside and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on mine. Cordelia, he began, his voice trembling slightly. I need to tell you something. I knew what he was going to say before the words left his mouth. I felt it in the way he looked at me, the way he seemed to struggle to hold himself back. I don't know how to say this without making things complicated, but I've never met anyone like you. The way you see the world, the way you've shared your life with me this week, it's made me realize things I didn't know I needed. My heart pounded as I searched for a response, but he continued before I could speak. I know it's wrong to feel this way, but I can't help it. You make me feel alive, Cordelia, in a way I've never felt before. The raw honesty in his voice left me breathless. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that this was impossible, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I reached out, my hand trembling as it found his. The moment our fingers touched, the tension that had been building between us seemed to break. He moved closer, his hand cupping mine as he looked into my eyes. Tell me to stop, he whispered. If this isn't what you want, tell me, and I'll stop. I couldn't find the strength to say it. The walls I had built around myself, the careful control I had maintained for so long, crumbled under the weight of his gaze. Emrys, I began, but the rest of my words were lost as he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a hesitant, tender kiss. The world seemed to tilt as I surrendered to the moment, my hands finding their way to his shoulders, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, and for the first time in years, I felt a rush of pure, unfiltered desire, a longing I had thought was long behind me. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, the reality of what we had done began to sink in. I'm sorry, he said, his voice shaky. I shouldn't have. No, I interrupted, my own voice trembling. Don't apologize. It's not just you. I couldn't finish the sentence. The truth of my feelings, so raw and unexpected, was too much to put into words. We sat there in silence, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil within me. I knew this couldn't continue, that the boundaries we had crossed would only lead to pain. But in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. The morning after our kiss, the cottage felt different, as though the storm that had raged outside had seeped to its walls, leaving a charged stillness behind. I woke early, hoping to ground myself in the familiar rhythm of kneading dough for the day's bread. My hands moved mechanically, but my thoughts were anything but calm. Images from the previous night played over and over in my mind, the warmth of his hand on mine, the way his lips had tasted faintly of wine, the raw emotion in his voice when he confessed how he felt. It was wrong. I knew that, but it didn't feel wrong in the moment. It felt inevitable, as though we had both been moving toward it all along. I heard footsteps behind me and froze, my breath catching. When I turned, Emrys was standing in the doorway, his dark hair slightly mussed, his expression unreadable. Good morning, he said softly. Good morning, I replied, forcing a smile. He hesitated, then stepped into the kitchen. Do you need help with anything? No, I'm fine, I said quickly, too quickly. His brow furrowed, but he didn't press me. Instead, he took a seat at the table, his hands resting on its surface. Cordelia, he began, his voice careful, about last night? I turned away, focusing on the dough in front of me. We don't need to talk about it. But we do, he insisted. I don't want you to think that I regret it, because I don't. I meant everything I said. I closed my eyes, the weight of his words settling over me. Emrys, we can't, whatever this is, whatever we feel, it can't go anywhere. You know that as well as I do. I know, he said quietly, but that doesn't make it any easier to ignore. I turned to face him then, my hands covered in flour, my heart heavy. I don't want you to feel like you've done something wrong. This is on me as much as it is on you. But you have your whole life ahead of you, Emrys. And I trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. You what? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. I've already had my chances, I said finally. I've lived my life, made my choices. This, whatever it is between us, it's just a moment, a fleeting connection. It's not something we can hold on to. He looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping slightly. I don't see it that way, he murmured. Neither of us spoke after that, the silence between us thick with unspoken emotions. That day, we avoided each other as much as possible. Bram returned from town in high spirits, oblivious to the tension that had settled between us. I busied myself in the garden, pulling weeds with more force than necessary, while Emrys disappeared into the guest room, presumably editing photos or pretending to. When dinner came, the three of us sat together, but the easy camaraderie of the past few days was gone. Bram filled the silence with stories about his day, while Emrys and I offered polite nods and smiles, careful not to let our eyes linger too long on each other. After Bram went to bed, I found myself alone in the sitting room, staring into the dying embers of the fire. I told myself I should go to bed, that tomorrow would bring clarity, but my thoughts wouldn't quiet. Cordelia. His voice startled me, and I turned to find Emrys standing in the doorway. "I'm sorry," he said, his expression earnest. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I couldn't sleep." "Neither could I admitted, motioning for him to join me. He sat down across from me, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "About how this can't go anywhere." I nodded, my chest tightening. "You're right," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I know you're right, but that doesn't change how I feel about you." "Emrys, please, just let me say this," he interrupted gently. "I don't expect anything from you, and I know I have no right to ask for more than you're willing to give. But I need you to know that you've changed me, Cordelia. You've reminded me of what it feels like to be inspired, to see the world as something beautiful and full of possibility." His words brought tears to my eyes, and I looked away, unable to face the intensity of his gaze. "You've changed me too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But that doesn't make this any easier. In fact, it makes it harder." He reached across the small table and took my hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I'll leave tomorrow if that's what you want, but please, don't think of this as a mistake. What we've shared, it's not something I'll ever regret." I met his eyes then, and in them I saw a reflection of my own turmoil, longing, sadness, and a quiet acceptance of what had to be. "Thank you," I said softly, squeezing his hand, "for everything." The next morning, Emrys packed his things while I prepared breakfast. Bram was his usual cheerful self, chatting about plans for their next trip, oblivious to the weight hanging in the air. When the time came for them to leave, Emrys lingered behind as Bram loaded the car. "I guess this is goodbye," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "For now," I replied, forcing a smile, "but I expect to see your name in magazines someday, paired with stunning photos of desserts and dishes I could never dream of creating." He chuckled softly, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You'll always be my inspiration, Cordelia." Before I could respond, he stepped forward and pressed a light kiss to my cheek. It was quick, fleeting, but it left me breathless all the same. "Take care," he said, his voice barely audible before turning and walking out the door. I watched from the window as Bram and Emrys drove away, their car disappearing down the winding road. For a long time I stood there, my heart heavy with the weight of their absence. But as the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the garden, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. What we had shared was fleeting, yes, but it was also beautiful, a reminder that even in the quiet seasons of life, there's still room for connection, for inspiration, for love. The silence in the house felt heavier after they left. For the first time in a week, I was alone again, surrounded by the comforting hum of a life I had built, but now aware of the void their departure had left behind. I returned to the kitchen, the heart of my home, and found myself drawn to the croquembouche we had made together. A few golden pastries remained, their delicate caramel threads glinting in the sunlight streaming through the window. I picked one up, the texture crisp between my fingers, and took a bite. The sweetness flooded my senses, but it was bittersweet, much like the memories of Emrys. I didn't allow myself to linger in sadness for long. Instead, I did what I always did when life felt unsteady. I cooked. I threw myself into creating something new, letting my hands work while my mind wandered. I thought of Emrys's questions, his curiosity, the way he had looked at me as if I held all the answers he sought. I thought of the conversations we'd had late into the night, the way he'd helped me see myself in ways I hadn't in years. And then, I thought of the way his hand had felt on mine, his lips brushing against my cheek that final morning. I told myself I had made the right choice, that sending him away was the only option. But even so, I couldn't deny the ache of his absence, the sense of possibility that had left with him. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice changes in myself. I spent more time in the garden, experimenting with herbs I hadn't used in years. I reopened some of my old recipe books, the ones I had tucked away when I thought I no longer needed them. I even started writing again, small notes and reflections about food, memory, and the ways our lives intersect with the meals we share. I had forgotten how much I loved the act of putting my thoughts into words, of creating something lasting from the fleeting moments of inspiration. It was during one of these writing sessions that a package arrived. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Emrys's. Inside was a small collection of photographs, carefully mounted and labeled. Each one was a masterpiece. The golden croquembouche we had made together, its caramel threads catching the light, the herb garden outside my kitchen, a tangle of green and sunlight, a portrait of me at the counter, flour dusting my hands, my expression one of serene focus. But it was the note that brought tears to my eyes. Dear Cordelia, thank you for everything you've given me. Not just the skills and advice, but the inspiration to see the world differently. Your passion, your wisdom, and your kindness have left an indelible mark on me. I hope these photos capture even a fraction of the beauty I saw during my time with you. They are a reflection of all that you've shared, all that you are. With gratitude, Emrys, I sat with the photos for a long time, running my fingers over the smooth edges, letting his words sink in. He was right. I had shared a part of myself with him, just as he had shared a part of himself with me. And though our time together had been brief, it had awakened something within me. Something I hadn't realized I had lost. The following week, I decided to make some changes. I reached out to a few former students and offered to host a weekend workshop at the cottage. The idea of sharing my kitchen again, of teaching and connecting with others, filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. On the morning of the workshop, as I stood in the kitchen preparing for my guests, I caught a glimpse of Emrys's photo of the croquembouche, now framed and hanging on the wall. It was a reminder of that fleeting, beautiful week and all it had taught me about myself. When the first student arrived, a young woman eager to learn the secrets of pastry, I greeted her with a smile and an open heart. "What will we be making today?" she asked, her excitement contagious. I glanced at the photo on the wall, then back at her. "Something ambitious," I said, "but worth it." As I moved through the day, guiding my students through the art of creating something intricate and beautiful, I felt a sense of joy I hadn't known in years. I thought of Emrys often, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Some connections, I realized, aren't meant to last forever. They are fleeting, like the perfect moment when a soufflé rises or caramel hardens into golden threads. But their impact lingers, shaping us in ways we don't always understand. And so, as the sun set over the cottage, casting warm light over the students gathered in my kitchen, I felt a quiet contentment settle over me. I was still Cordelia Parrish, the woman who had built a life out of flour and fire, love and loss. And though my story had taken an unexpected turn, it was far from over. It was an accident, one of those small, meaningless moments you'd never expect to matter. I was walking across the patio, my hands full of laundry, when a sudden gust of wind caught the edge of my skirt and lifted it high. I froze. I didn't need to turn around to know someone had seen. When I did, I found my stepson Mark standing there. His eyes met mine, and in that one charged second, everything changed. It was such a small thing, one of those meaningless moments that you'd never expect to linger, let alone change everything. A gust of wind, the hem of a skirt, and a glance I shouldn't have noticed. But I did. I was outside that day, heading to the laundry line. The sun was bright, cutting through the cool breeze, the kind of spring day that felt too perfect to ignore. My husband David was in his home office on one of his never-ending calls, and the house felt quieter than usual. I had always liked the silence. It gave me space to think, to breathe. I don't know if it was my age or my marriage, but there had been years of this silence, comfortable, but empty. David and I shared routines, not intimacy. I couldn't even remember the last time he noticed what I wore or how I looked. I didn't mind it, or at least that's what I told myself. I was carrying a small basket of laundry, just some light sheets and towels I'd planned to air dry. The patio was clear, and I didn't think anyone was around. I stepped outside, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face as I crossed toward the line David had installed for me last summer. The basket was awkward in my arms, so I didn't see the wind coming. I didn't even hear it. It swept up out of nowhere, a sudden, sharp gust that caught the hem of my skirt and pulled it high, like something out of an old movie. For a second, I froze. The moment stretched endlessly as I scrambled to grab at the fabric, twisting the basket under one arm as I pressed my skirt back into place. I could feel the burn in my cheeks already, a flush of embarrassment, even though I thought I was alone. But then I turned my head, and that's when I saw him. Mark. He was standing near the garage holding something in his hand, maybe a wrench or a rag, I don't know. It didn't matter. He wasn't working anymore. He was staring. Our eyes met, and the air seemed to still around me. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Mark didn't look away. It wasn't shock I saw on his face, and it wasn't amusement either. It was something else. Something that made the heat rise higher in my chest. His expression was calm, unreadable, but his eyes stayed locked on mine, lingering just long enough to make my pulse quicken. I turned away sharply, my hands still clutching my skirt, as if the wind might strike again. I pretended to focus on the laundry line, on hanging up a sheet, anything to give myself a reason not to look back. My heart was pounding, so loud I could feel it in my throat. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a stupid accident. A silly, forgettable thing. But it didn't feel forgettable. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. I stayed busy, folding clothes, wiping counters, doing anything I could to keep my hands and mind occupied. It was ridiculous, I knew that. Mark hadn't said anything, hadn't done anything. He just looked. But that look had unsettled me in a way I couldn't shake. I told myself it was because I was embarrassed, because I hadn't felt that kind of exposure in years. But as I paced through the house, replaying the moment over and over again, I realized it wasn't just embarrassment I was feeling. It was something else. Something I didn't want to name. That evening I stayed upstairs as long as I could, hiding behind the excuse of a headache. I could hear David and Mark talking downstairs, low, muffled voices I couldn't make out. Mark had been living with us for a month now, ever since he'd come back from school. He was quiet, polite, and mostly kept to himself. He wasn't a boy anymore, though. I hadn't really noticed that until now. He carried himself differently, confident, assured. I had always thought of him as just David's son, but I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen the way he looked at me this afternoon. The thought made my stomach twist. The next morning, I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. I woke early, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table flipping through an old magazine. The house was quiet, still half asleep. I was halfway through an article I wasn't really reading when I heard footsteps. I looked up, and there he was. Mark. He walked into the kitchen, his hair still tousled from sleep, wearing a plain white t-shirt and gray sweatpants. It was nothing special, but there was an ease about him. A calm confidence that made my pulse quicken again. "Morning," I said, my voice coming out tighter than I'd meant. "Morning," he replied, his tone even. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip as he looked at me. His gaze wasn't intense, but it wasn't casual either. I could feel it, lingering, just like it had yesterday. I looked down quickly, flipping a page in the magazine as if it held something urgent. My hands trembled slightly, though I hoped he didn't notice. He didn't say anything else. He just stood there, quiet and watchful, as if he was waiting for me to say something first. I couldn't. Finally, he pushed off the counter, set his empty glass in the sink, and walked out of the room without another word. I let out a shaky breath, the silence pressing down on me. I told myself again that it was nothing, that I was imagining things, reading into something that didn't exist. But I knew I wasn't. Because when Mark looked at me now, there was something different in his eyes. And the worst part? I didn't hate it. That afternoon, as I was trimming the roses in the backyard, I caught sight of Mark again. He was washing his car, the sunlight glinting off the water as he moved around it. I watched him from a distance, my shears paused mid-air as he wiped down the hood, his muscles shifting beneath his shirt with every motion. I shook my head sharply, forcing myself to look away. My heart was racing again, my hands trembling as I gripped the shears tighter. This was wrong, I thought. I had no reason to feel this way. But as I turned back to my roses, I couldn't stop myself from glancing his way one last time. Something shifted after that day on the patio. It was subtle at first, like a faint hum I could barely hear but couldn't ignore. It followed me everywhere, lingering in the air when I passed Mark in the hallway, clinging to the silence of the house when David wasn't home. I told myself I was imagining it. I wanted to believe that what had happened, the wind, the skirt, the look, was insignificant. But I knew better. Deep down, I could feel the change between us, and it terrified me. I avoided Mark as much as I could after that. I spent more time in my room or hiding behind projects, reorganizing closets that didn't need reorganizing, cooking meals that were far too elaborate for just the three of us. I threw myself into my gardening, spending hours pulling weeds and planting flowers until my knees ached. Anything to stay busy. Anything to stay away from him. But it didn't matter. Mark was always there, quiet, steady, and unshakable. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He didn't touch me. He didn't say anything inappropriate. But there was something about the way he looked at me that I couldn't handle. It wasn't disrespectful. It wasn't mocking. It was just knowing. That was the part I couldn't stand. Because every time his eyes lingered on me, I knew he'd seen me that day. He wasn't forgetting it. And neither was I. The days blurred together in the way they always did. David was working longer hours again, disappearing into his office or leaving for meetings that sometimes stretched into weekends. I used to miss him, years ago when he first started staying late. Now I just felt relieved. It wasn't that I didn't love him anymore. I think, in some quiet, worn-out way, I did. But love like ours wasn't alive anymore. It didn't move or grow. It was a memory, something we both held on to out of habit. I'd gotten used to it. And then Mark came home, and suddenly everything felt different. I noticed it again one evening. It was late, and I'd just finished tidying up the kitchen. I was standing at the sink, scrubbing a stubborn pan, when I felt it. That familiar awareness that I wasn't alone. I turned my head slightly and saw him leaning against the doorway, watching me. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond right away. He just tilted his head slightly, his gaze lingering a moment too long before he finally walked into the room. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the counter, a few feet away, but the space between us felt smaller than it should have. I focused on the pan, scrubbing harder than necessary, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel his eyes on me still, the weight of his gaze pressing into my back. It made me feel exposed in a way I hadn't felt in years. When I finally glanced at him, he was still watching me. "What?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Mark shrugged, taking a sip of water. "Nothing." That was all he said before turning and walking out of the room. But that look stayed with me. It burned into my thoughts, following me even as I lay in bed later that night, staring at the ceiling. It only got worse from there. The unspoken tension between us stretched tighter with each passing day. I caught him watching me constantly, when I was folding laundry, when I was cooking dinner, when I was standing in the garden pulling weeds. His eyes would linger, heavy and unreadable, and it made my skin prickle every time. At first I told myself it was just my imagination. I thought maybe I was projecting my own guilt onto him, reading into things that weren't there. But then I started noticing the small things. The way Mark always seemed to be nearby, no matter where I was. The way his hand would brush against mine when he passed me something at dinner. The way his voice would drop just slightly when he spoke to me, low and steady, sending a shiver down my spine. It was nothing. Little things. Insignificant on their own. But together, they felt like something more. It all came to a head one afternoon. I was in the sunroom, sitting in my favorite chair by the window, trying to lose myself in a book. It wasn't working. I kept rereading the same paragraph over and over again, the words blurring together as my mind wandered. I don't know how long I sat there before I noticed him. Mark was in the backyard, shirtless, working on something with his hands, probably fixing the latch on the shed. The sunlight caught on his skin, making him look golden and unreal, and I hated myself for noticing. I stared for far too long before I realized what I was doing. My cheeks flushed with shame, and I turned quickly back to the book, gripping it so tightly the pages crinkled. It didn't matter. I couldn't concentrate. I heard the back door open a few minutes later, and my breath caught. I didn't look up, but I could feel him coming closer, his footsteps soft against the hardwood floor. "Good book?" he asked, his voice low. I forced myself to look up, hoping my face didn't betray me. "It's fine." He didn't say anything else. He just stood there, his gaze lingering on me the way it always did now, calm, steady, and unshakable. I shifted in my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you need something?" Mark shook his head, but he didn't move. I wanted to tell him to leave, to go back outside and let me have my peace. But the words wouldn't come. I couldn't say them, because part of me didn't want him to go, and that terrified me more than anything. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he looked at me, about the way I couldn't bring myself to stop him. It wasn't just about that day on the patio anymore. It had grown into something else, something I didn't want to admit to myself. I told myself it wasn't real. It was just in my head, just a product of loneliness and a marriage that had grown cold. But the way Mark looked at me said otherwise. And worse, the way I felt when he did. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to make it stop. And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to. A line only exists until you cross it. Once you do, it's gone forever. And the space where it used to be becomes something else, something you can't take back. I didn't know exactly when I stopped thinking of Mark as David's son. I only knew that once it happened, there was no turning back. The tension that had been simmering between us for days finally boiled over one night. It was inevitable, I think, as I look back now. A slow-burning fuse that had been quietly eating its way toward the powder keg while I pretended not to notice. It was a Thursday evening. The house was silent, wrapped in that empty stillness that used to comfort me, but now left me feeling exposed. David was out of town again. He'd left that morning for a 2-day conference, promising, as always, to call when he had a moment. I didn't expect a moment. I rarely got them anymore. The evening air felt warm and heavy as I moved through the house, restless and unable to settle. I turned on the television in the living room, trying to drown out the silence, but I couldn't focus on anything. I kept glancing at the clock, listening for sounds that weren't there. I didn't hear him come in. When I turned, Mark was standing in the doorway. He leaned casually against the frame, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans. He looked at me the way he always did now, calm and quiet, his gaze unflinching, like he knew something I didn't. My pulse quickened. I turned back to the television, pretending I hadn't noticed him, though I could feel him still watching me. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, my voice thin. He didn't answer right away. I heard his footsteps as he moved further into the room. He sat down on the other end of the couch, close enough that I could feel the weight of him there. The air between us felt charged. I didn't look at him, but I could sense him watching me. It made my skin tingle, made me hyper-aware of the way my hands were gripping the edge of my skirt. I could have left. I could have stood up and disappeared into my bedroom, closing the door behind me, like I had so many other nights. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed rooted in place, my breath shallow, my heart thudding heavily in my chest. I don't know how long we sat there like that, silent and unmoving, before he shifted. It was subtle, a small movement that shouldn't have meant anything. His arm lifted, resting on the back of the couch, his fingers barely brushing my shoulder. I froze. He didn't say anything. He didn't move again. It wasn't an accident, though. I knew that. The touch was light, deliberate, a question he wasn't asking out loud. The smart thing to do would have been to stand up, to walk away and pretend it never happened. But instead, I turned my head to look at him. Mark met my gaze, his expression steady. He wasn't uncertain. He wasn't afraid. I should have been. "Mark?" I started, but my voice faltered. I didn't know what I was going to say, anyway. His hand moved then, slow and deliberate, his fingers brushing against my shoulder again, before trailing down my arm. The touch sent a shiver through me, my skin suddenly alive and burning. "Don't," I whispered, though it came out weak, unconvincing. He didn't stop. His hand lingered against my arm, warm and steady, and I hated the way my body responded to it, the way my breath hitched, the way I couldn't bring myself to pull away. Mark didn't say anything, he just watched me, waiting. I should have told him to leave. I should have reminded him who I was, who he was. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed there, frozen in place as his hand moved higher, brushing against my neck, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw. I closed my eyes, my pulse racing as I felt him lean closer. When his lips touched mine, it was soft at first, tentative, like he was giving me time to stop him. But I didn't. I kissed him back. The moment I did, something inside me broke. The kiss deepened, and all the tension that had been building between us for days, weeks, months, came crashing down all at once. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer until my body pressed against his. I felt weightless, dizzy, every thought in my head drowned out by the way he was touching me. I shouldn't have wanted it. I knew that. But in that moment, I didn't care. I didn't care about David or the consequences or the line we were crossing. All I cared about was the way Mark made me feel, alive, seen, wanted. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my heart hammering in my chest. I stared at him, my hands trembling as they gripped the front of his shirt. "This can't happen," I whispered, though I didn't let go of him. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. His eyes told me everything. He wasn't going to stop. And neither was I. I spent the rest of the night in my room, curled up under the covers, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I could still feel him, his hands on my waist, his lips on mine, the heat of his body against me. I told myself it was a mistake, that it couldn't happen again. But even as I thought it, I knew I was lying. The truth was, I didn't want to stop. I wanted more. The next morning, I avoided him. I stayed in my room as long as I could, then disappeared into the garden, keeping my hands busy with the endless pruning and weeding. But when I finally walked back into the house, Mark was there. He was sitting at the kitchen table, reading something on his phone. He looked up when I entered, and for a long moment, we just stared at each other. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. But in that silence, I knew. We'd already crossed the line. And there was no turning back. Crossing the line was supposed to make me stop. That's what I told myself, that once it happened, reality would come crashing down, forcing me to pull back before things spiraled any further. But it didn't. Instead, it opened something inside me I hadn't felt in years. It was as if I had been sleepwalking through my life, and Mark had shaken me awake. I felt alive, awake in ways I didn't think possible anymore. And for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. That was the most dangerous part of all. At first, we were careful. Or maybe we just thought we were. It started with quiet moments stolen in the empty spaces of the house. Small, silent exchanges that made my skin burn and my pulse race. A lingering look in the hallway. His hand brushing against mine when he passed me a coffee mug. The way he would stand just a little too close when he walked up behind me, his breath warm on the back of my neck. None of it was innocent, but none of it felt deliberate either. It just happened. I would find myself holding my breath whenever Mark entered a room, my heart speeding up, like I was a teenager again. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. His presence said everything I was trying to deny. It was late one evening, when everything escalated. David had left that morning for another 2-day trip, and the house felt emptier than usual. I told myself I would keep my distance, but I had given up pretending long ago. I was in the laundry room, folding clothes when I heard footsteps behind me. I knew it was him before I turned around. My breath hitched as I felt him there, standing close enough that I could sense the warmth of him at my back. I froze, the freshly folded towel gripped tightly in my hands. "Mark, what are you doing?" I wanted my voice to sound firm, but it came out shaky and weak. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. I felt him move closer, his body just inches from mine now, his hands sliding gently around my waist. I didn't pull away. I closed my eyes as his lips brushed against the side of my neck, a soft, deliberate touch that sent a shiver through me. My chest rose and fell in shallow breaths as I gripped the counter in front of me, trying to steady myself. "This can't," I whispered, but the words felt hollow, meaningless, even as I said them. Mark turned me to face him then, his hands resting firmly on my hips as he looked down at me. His expression was calm, steady, but his eyes burned with something I didn't want to name. I didn't fight him. I didn't resist when he leaned down to kiss me. The moment his lips touched mine, everything else disappeared. The house, the guilt, the ghost of David somewhere out there living his life. There was only Mark. That night, I let it happen. I didn't stop him when his hands slipped under my shirt, or when he led me upstairs, his fingers tangled with mine as we moved through the darkened house like thieves. I didn't stop him when we fell into the guest room bed, the sheets cool against my skin as he pressed his body against mine. I didn't stop him, because I didn't want to. I let go of everything. Every thought, every doubt, every whisper of guilt that tried to pull me back. I let myself be what I hadn't been in years. A woman, alive and wanted. I don't know how long we stayed there, wrapped in each other, the quiet hum of the house around us. But when I finally lay beside him, my body exhausted and my mind spinning, I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. Peace. It didn't last. The next morning, everything felt sharper, more real. I woke before the sun rose, tangled in sheets that weren't mine, with Mark still asleep beside me. His arm was draped across my waist, his breathing deep and steady, and for a moment, I let myself pretend that none of this was wrong. But then reality came creeping back in, cold and cruel. I slipped out of bed carefully, moving slowly so I wouldn't wake him, and gathered my clothes from where they'd been tossed carelessly to the floor. I stood in the doorway for just a moment, looking back at him. He looked peaceful in sleep, younger somehow, and I felt something twist in my chest. Guilt, longing, I wasn't sure. Then I turned and walked out. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every sound, every movement. I avoided Mark, disappearing into the garden for hours and pretending to be too busy to notice anything else. I told myself it was just one night, that it wouldn't happen again. But that was a lie. Because when the sun set and David's absence settled heavily into the house again, I found myself lingering in the hallway outside the guest room. The door was open just slightly, a sliver of light spilling into the darkened hall. I hesitated. I could have walked away. I could have gone back to my own room, shut the door, and pretended none of this had ever happened. But I didn't. I pushed the door open instead. Mark was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head lifted as he looked at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just stood, crossing the room in a few slow strides until he was standing in front of me. I didn't stop him when he touched my face, or when he leaned in to kiss me again. I didn't stop him, because I couldn't. We weren't careful after that. Or maybe we thought we were. The truth is, we were reckless, stealing moments whenever we could, wrapped up in something neither of us wanted to stop. It happened everywhere. In the quiet of the laundry room, with the sound of the washing machine humming softly around us. In the kitchen, late at night, when the house was silent and the moonlight spilled through the windows. In the garden, hidden between rows of roses, where Mark pressed me against the old wooden fence and kissed me like he was starving for me. We weren't thinking about what would happen if someone found out. We weren't thinking at all. I let myself get lost in him, his hands, his lips, the way he looked at me like I was the only woman who had ever existed. I didn't want to think about the consequences, because I knew if I did, it would all come crashing down. So I ignored the guilt. I ignored the voice in my head telling me this was dangerous. And for a little while, I let myself believe that we could keep this secret forever. Every secret has a lifespan. I knew this, even as I clung desperately to the lie I'd been living. The world was too small, the walls too thin, and no matter how careful we thought we were, cracks would always form. It didn't happen all at once. It started small, as most things do. Little shifts in the air, small moments that made my stomach twist, like I'd been caught without realizing it. The first time I felt it, I was in the kitchen. David had come home late from his trip, and I was cleaning up after dinner while he sat at the table, reading the mail. Mark was upstairs, his presence like a shadow hovering at the edges of my mind. David didn't say anything as he flipped through a stack of papers, but I could feel him watching me out of the corner of his eye. Not directly, not overtly, just a lingering glance that felt heavier than it should have. "Everything okay?" I asked casually, my voice tight. He didn't answer right away. He just shrugged and muttered something about the office before turning his attention back to the mail. I told myself I was imagining things, but I wasn't. It was small things like that at first. A neighbor stopping me at the mailbox, their smile a little too tight as they asked if everything was all right at home. A car I didn't recognize, parked across the street for what felt like hours, its engine off, its windows dark. The worst, though, was the feeling of being watched. I'd be folding laundry or sitting in the sunroom with a book, and suddenly, the hair on the back of my neck would stand on end. I'd turn my head sharply, expecting to see someone there, but the house would be empty. Quiet. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was letting guilt get the better of me. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like the walls of the house were pressing in on me, each room too small, each silence too loud. And then the note came. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I had just come back from running errands. Mark was out. He'd mentioned something about meeting a friend, and the house felt unnervingly still. I pulled the mail out of the box, sorting through bills and advertisements as I walked back inside. I was halfway to the kitchen when I saw it, a small, plain white envelope tucked between the credit card offers. There was no name on the front, no return address. My hands trembled as I opened it, a sick feeling curling in the pit of my stomach. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly into thirds. "I know what you're doing." The words were typed, sharp and cold against the white background. There was no signature, no explanation, just that one sentence, damning and undeniable. I felt the air leave my lungs as I sank down into a chair, my fingers tightening around the note. My mind raced, replaying every moment, every stolen glance, every touch, every kiss. Who knew? How had they seen? I thought about the car parked across the street, about the neighbor's strange smile, about dating at the kitchen table. Was it him? Did he know? For a long time, I sat there, staring at the paper, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might be sick. When I finally stood up, I folded the note carefully and tucked it into the back of a drawer in the kitchen, as though hiding it would make it disappear. But it didn't. The words stayed with me, hanging in the air like smoke. That night, I lay in bed with the note still echoing in my head. David was beside me, fast asleep, his breathing steady and even. I turned onto my side, staring at the wall as my mind spun. What if he already knew? What if he was just waiting for the right moment to confront me? I thought about Mark, about the way his hands felt on me, the way he looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. The memory should have brought me comfort, but now, it only filled me with dread. We were being watched, and sooner or later, the truth would come out. The next morning, Mark knew something was wrong. He came into the kitchen as I was making coffee, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied me. I didn't look at him, keeping my back to him as I poured steaming water into the mug. "Are you okay?" His voice was low, careful. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set the mug down before I spilled it. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. I could feel him waiting for me to say something, to look at him, but I couldn't. Finally, he moved closer. I felt his hand brush against my back. Gentle, reassuring. "What happened?" he asked softly. I pulled away from him sharply, turning to face him. My chest felt tight, my pulse pounding in my ears as I shook my head. "Nothing," I whispered. Mark's gaze lingered on me, his expression unreadable. But he didn't push. He just nodded once before stepping back, his hand dropping to his side. I watched him leave the room, my throat tight, my stomach in knots. I hated the distance I was forcing between us, but I didn't know what else to do. Whoever had left that note wasn't just threatening me, they were threatening us. And the worst part was that I didn't know who it was. The second note arrived 3 days later. This time, it wasn't in the mailbox. It was on the kitchen counter, waiting for me when I came downstairs in the morning. "Does he know yet?" The message was the same as before. Typed, simple, and chilling. I dropped it as though it had burned me, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I stared at it. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the fear so overwhelming I thought my legs might give out beneath me. David was in the shower upstairs. Mark was still asleep. That meant someone had been in the house. I felt sick. My hands shook as I grabbed the note and shoved it into the trash, burying it under coffee grounds and crumpled paper towels. But even as I did, I knew it didn't matter. Whoever it was wouldn't stop. They wanted me to know they were watching. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. I moved through the house like a ghost, jumping at every sound, every creak of the floorboards. I barely ate, and every time I caught sight of Mark, I felt my chest tighten. He knew something was wrong. I could see it in the way he watched me, his eyes lingering a little too long, his expression full of questions he didn't ask. But I couldn't tell him. I couldn't let him know that everything we'd been hiding was starting to come undone. That night, I sat alone, in the darkened living room, my knees pulled to my chest as I stared at the window. The curtains were drawn, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, looking in, watching, waiting. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Secrets unravel the same way a thread pulls from a sweater, slowly at first, almost unnoticed, until everything comes apart in one violent, inevitable snap. I had known for days that something was coming, that the quiet hum of our house was about to explode into chaos. But knowing didn't make it any easier when it happened. The day everything fell apart started like any other. I woke up before dawn. David was still asleep beside me, his body curled away, as distant in sleep as he was when awake. I sat up carefully, feeling my bones protest, and moved quietly to the bathroom, shutting the door behind me. In the mirror, I looked older. The soft yellow light did me no favors. Lines I couldn't ignore traced the edges of my eyes, and the hollow exhaustion of these last few weeks lingered under my skin. I turned on the faucet and splashed water on my face, as though it could wash the guilt away. It didn't. By the time I came downstairs, Mark was already awake. He was sitting at the table, a mug of coffee in his hand, his gaze focused on the window. The early light cast shadows across his face, sharpening his features, making him look older, harder. I hesitated in the doorway, my heart still twisted every time I saw him, even now, especially now. He looked up when he heard me, and for a long moment we just stared at each other. There was so much unspoken between us, so much hanging in the air, it felt as though the house might buckle under the weight of it. I turned away quickly, walking to the counter to pour myself a cup of coffee. My hands were steady, but I felt like I was splintering inside. That afternoon, the truth came for me. David was supposed to be at the office all day, but I heard his car pull into the driveway just after lunch. The sound of the engine made my blood run cold. I stood at the sink, frozen, watching the driveway through the window as he stepped out and slammed the door behind him. Something was wrong. I turned, catching sight of Mark sitting on the couch in the living room, his expression shifting to something guarded. He felt it too, that quiet, electric sense of something breaking. The front door opened, and David's heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face was red, his eyes sharp and cold in a way I'd never seen before. He wasn't carrying his briefcase. He was holding a manila envelope. My stomach dropped. "What is this, Hannah?" David's voice was low, but it trembled slightly, as though he was holding back something bigger. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, my chest constricting painfully as I looked at the envelope. I already knew what was inside. "Look at it," David said, his voice louder now. He threw the envelope onto the table, the paper sliding across the surface before stopping near the edge. I forced my feet to move, stepping closer to the table. My hands shook as I picked it up, tugging open the flap to pull out the photographs inside. My heart stopped. The pictures were grainy, taken from a distance, but they were damning. Mark and I in the garden, his body too close to mine. Another one of us in the kitchen, his hand brushing against my arm. And the worst, us in the laundry room, his lips near my neck, my eyes closed, a look on my face that left no room for doubt. Someone had been watching. Someone had seen everything. The room spun. I felt nauseous, my hands trembling as I dropped the photos back onto the table. "How long has this been going on?" David's voice was low, dangerous. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, but no words came. My mouth opened, but I couldn't force sound through the knot in my throat. David turned sharply, his gaze landing on Mark, who had risen from the couch and was now standing in the doorway. "You." His voice was full of venom. "You've been sneaking around with my wife?" Mark didn't flinch. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his expression unreadable, his posture steady, even as David took a step toward him. "Get out of my house," David growled. I finally found my voice. "David, please. Don't." He turned back to me, his face twisted with disgust. "How could you? How could either of you?" There were no words I could offer him. No explanation that would make this any less horrific in his eyes. The silence felt unbearable, a choking thing pressing into every corner of the room. "Leave," he said to Mark again. "Now." Mark was gone within the hour. I watched through the window as he loaded his things into his car, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. He didn't look back. When he finally drove away, the emptiness of the house closed in around me, suffocating and unrelenting. David didn't say another word to me that day. He disappeared into his office and shut the door behind him. That night, I lay in bed alone, staring at the ceiling, the sound of Mark's car leaving still echoing in my ears. I couldn't cry. I was too hollow, too raw. The house had never felt so empty. In the weeks that followed, everything fell apart. David filed for divorce, moving into a hotel while we sorted out the logistics. The neighbors knew, of course they did. People whispered behind their hands when I passed them on the street, their smiles thin and sharp, their curiosity barely hidden. I stopped answering the phone. I stopped checking the mail. I didn't see Mark again. I thought about him constantly, though. I replayed those stolen moments in my head over and over again, clinging to them even as they brought me pain. The way he looked at me. The way his hands felt on my skin. The way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. I told myself I should hate him, but I couldn't. He had been the match that set everything ablaze, but I had been the one to strike it. One day, as I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, I found an envelope slipped under the door. My chest tightened as I opened it, my fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "I'm sorry for everything. I'll come back for you someday." It wasn't signed, but I knew who it was from. I sat there for a long time, staring at those words, my chest tight and aching. I didn't know if I believed him. I didn't know if I wanted to. But for the first time in weeks, I let myself smile, just a little.